Between 1984 and 1988, a particular metro area in the southeastern United States suffered a spat of violent murders. The victims had no commonalities. Age, gender, color, appearance, occupation, socio-economic status, nothing matched. Victims included middle school students and notorious cartel members, street cops and lawyers, charity directors and investment bankers, pharmaceutical executives and gas station clerks. The only reason authorities had any idea that the murders were related was because of the killer's unique calling card, a scattering of blood-drenched pigeon feathers. As months passed and the body count mounted, law enforcement came into possession of one single piece of eyewitness testimony. Following the violent death of a firefighter, a middle-aged woman was spotted limping away from the scene, bleeding profusely from a gaping wound in her hip. According to the witness, the woman was tiny, bird-like in her thinness, shuffling like someone elderly. Notably, a flock of pigeons followed her, bobbing along beside her like an urban adaptation of the Pied Piper. This sighting was ultimately dismissed due to one impossible detail. The woman was covered in grey feathers. A second sighting was reported 1 year later, and was again dismissed. Similar sightings continued to crop up over the years, every one of them ignored. In 1988, and entirely by chance, a bloody feather came into possession of AHH during the commission of a separate task. The feathers were then brought to NASCU. Peculiarities surrounding the appearance and physiology of the feathers were noted by specialized personnel, most notably T-Class Agent Wolf. At this time, the agency launched an investigation of its own. The investigation culminated in July 1988. During surveillance of the target, a very thin woman who was always trailed by a flock of pigeons, and who always wore a long, heavy trench coat, even in the humid summer heat, she managed to infiltrate a house that functioned as a front for human trafficking. What resulted was a bloodbath. The target was badly wounded and therefore sufficiently weakened due to the energy expended during the attack. Agency personnel were able to take her into custody. Her capture was not without incident, as the flock of pigeons surrounding her began to attack. One pigeon, a particularly large male with one eye, refused to leave her side. As a result, the animal was brought into custody with her. He was later observed to pluck his feathers and place them on top of the woman's astounding number of serious wounds. Incredibly, the feathers facilitated rapid healing. It must be noted that the woman came into agency custody during a time when consideration and respect for our extraordinary inmates was at a low ebb. Due to her dress, her age, her general appearance, and of course her flock of pigeons, personnel dubbed the entity the Bag Lady. The Bag Lady is a middle-aged woman of almost extraordinary thinness. Her hair is short and grey, her eyes are large and a vivid, bright orange identical in hue to the eyes of the pigeon who came into custody with her. Like her pigeon, she is covered in feathers. Unlike many inmates, the Bag Lady is articulate, intelligent, and possesses full speech and language capabilities. Nevertheless, for the entire length of her incarceration, the Bag Lady has refused to speak with staff for any meaningful length of time. When asked why, her answer is always the same: because I don't talk to cops. This is admittedly understandable, given that the Bag Lady acted in an exclusively extrajudicial capacity to extremely violent effect. Despite decades of consistent questioning and other less savory methods to break her down, the Bag Lady has continued to refuse meaningful engagement with agency personnel. In fact, the only meaningful contact the Bag Lady has had with personnel consists of attacks both attempted and achieved. On 4 different occasions, however, she has been observed attempting to engage fellow inmates in conversation. Notably, the Bag Lady speaks extensively and frequently to her pigeon. The pigeon does not answer, but agency personnel believe the bird is extraordinarily intelligent and that it communicates with her non-verbally. Due to potential similarities with the inmate called the Heart Bird, the pigeon is as closely monitored as the Bag Lady herself. Concerns over such similarities with the Heart Bird are the primary reason that the Bag Lady has never been evaluated for termination. Fortunately, the inmate's 35-year vow of silence was recently broken during an interview with T-Class Agent Raquel B. The insights provided are fascinating. The content of the interview poses serious questions regarding the nature of death, free will, the possibility and potential purpose of afterlife, and the processes through which chthonic entities come into being. One might even dare to say it provides a few answers as well. Please note I did not write that last line. My boss added it because he's a tool. Interview. Subject: the Bag Lady. Classification string: uncooperative, undetermined, chthonic, fixed, critical, terrace. Interviewer: Raquela B. Date: 11/22/2024. The first thing my son ever bought was birdseed. He was 4 years old. His grandma put $2 in his Christmas card that year, and he spent those dollars on pigeon food. Michael loved pigeons. He started talking to them before he ever said a word to me, watched them from windows when he was a baby, and cooed at them the way they coo at each other. His first smile was at them, not at me. His first hello went to a baby pigeon blinking stupidly in a nest on our fire escape. He loved them. As he got older, that love grew stronger. By the time he was kindergarten, those birds would follow him everywhere, bobbing their little heads. They ate out of his hands, flew down to his arms, sometimes even landed on his head, which made him laugh like nothing else. I'd been afraid of birds my whole life, so I didn't understand. I asked him one time why he loved them so much, how he could make friends with them. "It's easy, Mum," he said. "Pigeons think everyone's their friend. They already love you. All you do is love them back." I still didn't understand. Didn't really want to, I guess. I grew up learning that pigeons were vermin, dirty, ugly, unsanitary, brainless disease carriers. No, I didn't understand at all. But I did understand this. Like pigeons, my son thought everyone was his friend. When describing Michael, you might use the word gullible, but that isn't right. He wasn't gullible. He was smart. He was intuitive. He understood everyone. He could look at the worst person alive and find the smallest, weakest spark of goodness flickering forlornly in the vast dark. What he couldn't understand, what I couldn't make him understand, no matter how hard I tried, how loud I yelled, how mean or desperate or cruel I got, was that a spark is not light. A spark is just a spark, no more and maybe less. I could tell you about Michael's friends, how some were born monsters, how some were made, how badly the ones that were made, the ones that weren't born ruined, heart my hurt, and how that spark of sympathy got my guard just enough to make sure I lost my son. I saw him for the last time when he was 17. We were fighting about his friends, not the pigeons. I'd gotten used to them a long time ago. How they clustered around the fire escape every morning waiting for him to open the window. How they flocked down to the building entrance when it was time for him to leave for work. How his favorite bird, Mr. One-Eye, dive-bombed onto his shoulder every time they saw each other. No, we weren't fighting about pigeons. We were fighting about his other friends. It wasn't even a bad fight. Not worse than any of our other fights, anyway. It went the same way it always did. He told me I didn't understand like he always did. I told him he was being a little fool, and his friends would be the end of him like I always did. And he walked out the door to cool off, like he always did. I thought he'd call a few hours later, apologizing and asking for an apology in return like he always did. But he didn't call. I told myself he'd come home like he always did. But he didn't come home. And nobody cared. My boy never coming back was the worst thing, the very, very worst thing that is, was, or will ever be. But the fact that no one helped, that no one cared, that no one gave the tiniest spark of a damn, was almost as terrible. I went to the police 17 times. 17. One for each year he'd been alive. Each time they told me Michael was practically an adult. We'd had a fight, and he was fully in his rights not to come home. One cop even had the gall to me it was about time he stopped coming home. Another one said I was lucky he was gone, because otherwise he'd probably come home one day and cut my throat for drug money. The last cop took pity on me. She was a lady officer. Lady is the wrong word. She was a battle axe, built like a brick shithouse, with hair like rusty steel wool and the scariest eyes I have ever seen. But when she looked at me after I'd taken my 17th report, there was nothing scary about her eyes. They were only tired, sad, and lightless. That look in her eyes was how I knew no one would ever find my son, and that was the scariest thing of all. "Listen to me, hun," she said. "This is going to sound like the worst thing in the world. That's because it is, but it's also the only true thing anyone in this department is going to tell you. We have almost no resources. The few resources that we do have, they go to priorities. A dopehead dropout won't ever be a priority. But you can bet your ass some of the cops here will make it their priority to end a dopehead, especially one who's a pee-wee gangbanger. No one is going to help you. No one cares about your son but you." "You're wrong," I told her, even though I knew she wasn't. I didn't give up. I'll never give up on my boy. I went to other places for help. Citizen groups, social services, activists, community foundations, charities, all those places. At first it was wonderful. At first I thought I'd found my people because unlike the cops, they listened. They listened when I told them about my son, about how the first thing he ever bought was birdseed, and how the first word he ever said was for a baby pigeon, and how Mr. One Eye rode on his shoulder, and how he could look at the worst person alive and find the good. They listened to me, and they gave me hugs and coffee and cookies and prayers and recommendations to grief groups, and then they listened again. But they didn't do anything. Finally, I'd had enough of people who didn't do anything. When I said so to one of the group leaders, the one who was the best listener, the one who held my hands whenever I cried, said, "We're your people. We're here for you. We care about you." Grief and rage and frustration erupted, the most acute, potent frustration I'd ever felt, the kind that renders you mindless. "I need you to care about my son." "I understand, I hear you." No, you're wrong. I think you're wrong. I think you haven't heard a goddamn word I said." "I have, I do. I'm always here for you. I'm listening, but..." "But what?" She looked at me, eyes tired and full of pity. "We only have as much as we have. We can only do what we can with what we have. What else do you want me to do?" "Something," I said. "Anything." But she didn't. No one did. No one but me. And I kept on keeping on. Not because I wanted to, but because sometimes that's all you get. The ability to put one foot in front of the other. Left, right until you get somewhere else. Only I couldn't get anywhere else. The pigeons couldn't either. They didn't seem to understand that Michael was gone. As the days after his disappearance bled into weeks and the weeks hemorrhaged into months, the pigeons kept coming, flocking to the fire escape outside our little window, waiting for him to pop out with smiles and birdseed. His favorite pigeon, Mr. One Eye, even took to following me whenever I left the building. He watched me as if to say, "Where is he? Where did he go? Tell him we're waiting. Tell him we love him. Tell him we need him to come back." I couldn't help but wonder how they were feeling, if they were just confused and maybe a little hurt in their little bird brains, or if they understood. If they hurt as much as me, if they had holes in their hearts like me. Rotting, bottomless voids eating them from the inside out every second of every day. But I didn't know how to ask, and they wouldn't have been able to answer anyway. And then Mr. One Eye stopped showing up. He stayed gone for 1 day, then 2, then 3 and 4 and 5, and that's when I knew he wasn't coming back either. I hated that damn bird for leaving me. He was Michael's favorite. Michael had pigeons the way I'd had dogs, and that particular pigeon was his heart. Mr. One Eye was the closest thing my sweet boy had to a soulmate. So if even that bird had given up on him, he was truly gone. The 6th day after Mr. One Eye's absence was grey and wet, somehow dead. Rain sheeted from the sky, but without any ferocity, without any power. It felt tired, hopeless, helpless to stop itself from falling. I was kicking my way home from work, tired and hopeless and helpless as the rain. I didn't want to go to work. I didn't want to come home from work, either. I didn't want to walk, but I was still walking, eyes down, 1 foot in front of the other, left, right, left, right. All rain could do was fall, grey rain on grey streets. All I could do was walk, grey girl on grey streets. And then, out of the corner of my eye, so colourful it was almost obscene, I saw something. Brightness against the rain-slick concrete, a small explosion of an white, grey and sloppy wet red. I almost ignored it, 1 foot in front of the other because that's all you can do. Left, right, shoes slapping the sidewalk, dull and pointless, grey and empty. But that explosion of white and red didn't stay an explosion. It began to resolve, to take form. And the form it took was blood-caked feathers. The form it took was a crumpled grey chest, shimmering all pink and green and white as it panted. A pigeon. A pigeon some asshole had kicked out of the way, or maybe even stepped on, and left to die. A pigeon who hadn't run away from danger because it thought everyone was its friend. And what friend would ever be a danger? I had never seen anything so pathetic. I almost left it. But then I thought of Michael, and couldn't bear to leave it there. As I approached it, something bloomed in my chest. A feeling. I couldn't figure out what that feeling was, only that it was suffocating. I stopped and looked at the pigeon. It looked back with a single orange eye, fever-bright and fading even as I watched. It turned its head weakly, and that's when I saw it was missing an eye. The sheer weight of grief forced me to my knees, but that weight couldn't keep me from crawling across the grey, flooded sidewalk. It couldn't keep me from scooping up that bright, bloody explosion with desperate tenderness. It couldn't keep me from cradling that Mr. One eye to my chest like I'd cradled my son a lifetime ago. I sat there in the rain until long after night fell, sobbing and holding the bird to my heart long after he stopped moving. People passing by took me for homeless. A few dropped coins into my lap. One lady even knelt down and tried to coax me to a shelter down the road, till I screamed in her face and spat. No one stopped to help me after that. At some point I stood up and staggered home. I brought Mr. One Eye with me, holding him to my heart all the while. I got drunk that night. Blind, stinking, hideously drunk. Not because I like drinking. I hate it. But I hated having to feel the hole in my heart more. This rotting void, a bottomless chasm eating me from the inside out every second of every day. It felt like I should be dead. Only I wasn't. I felt like I was always dying, but never got to be dead. Dead would have been better, but I couldn't die. If I died, then no one on earth would care what happened to my baby. So I got drunk instead of dead. I didn't really think it would work. I hoped that it would. I always hope. Hope is the only thing some of us ever get. But being drunk didn't work. Being drunk just made me angrier and crazier. Being drunk made the rotting pit inside me grow up and out until it was swallowing me whole. Until it was the only thing in the world. Until it was the only thing I knew. The only thing I had ever known. The only thing I would ever know. I thought I was by myself in that void until I looked out the window and saw the pigeons on the fire escape. They alone were there in the pit with me. They alone understood. They alone cared what had happened to my son. So I opened the window by the fire escape and told them to come inside, sobbing every word. They swirled back in a panic, wings thundering. "No," I wept. "No, don't leave, don't leave. Come in. Come in here, you goddamn morons, come in." I reached for them. Everything tilted. The metal windowsill bit into my belly, then scraped down my legs as the world flipped upside down. The last thing I knew was the rush of wings, deafening but soft. Beautifully, perfectly, profoundly soft. For the first time that I could remember, I woke up in somebody's arms. I opened my eyes. A face looked down at me, an old man with round golden eyes and the gentlest smile I have ever seen, will probably ever see. I craned my neck. Pigeons surrounded us, a shifting, bright-eyed flock so huge it spilled off the sidewalks into the street. Their eyes shone like embers in the dark. I looked back at the man. His eyes shone too, and so did the skin of his face. He wasn't human. He couldn't be. For some reason, that didn't frighten me at all. "Who are you?" I craned my neck. "Are you an angel?" "No, I am one who listens." It sounds ridiculous, but I could literally hear the big letters in that title. They came out of his mouth, capitalized. Who listens to what? I listen to prayers. I listen to pain. I listen to rage. I listen to yours, you know. He smiled again, teeth shimmering. Then why? I blinked and shifted, groaning as electric pain bolted up my hip. If you listen to me, why didn't you ever answer? Because we who listen can never answer loudly. Sometimes we cannot answer at all. Each answer, however soft and quiet, takes from us. Often it takes something we aren't supposed to give. Always it gives something we can never get back. See? It held out its bare arms for my inspection. My stomach churned violently as the streetlight illuminated a relief map of pitted scars and worm-like welts and suppurating rotted pits like radiation burns. "What happened?" I gasped. "I listened, and I answered." He shook his silvery sleeves back down over his arms. My answers took what I did not have to give. Frustration bubbled up, hot and poisonous. If you can't do anything, then, what's the point? There is no point, I think, he said gently. It simply is. Are you a guardian angel? I repeated. We are not guardians, it said gently. We are listeners. Who is we? Me. He placed a hand on his chest. You. He pressed his other hand against my chest. We. I looked at him, revolted as terror built in my gut. Am I dead? There is no death for us. I'm sorry, but I do not understand. We who were suffering, we who were alone, now go to others who are suffering and alone. We stay with them and we listen. We listen so they can feel comfort. I had so many questions, but couldn't articulate a single one. And you were you with me. You saw my pain, all that rage, heard all those questions. Yes. Well, I never felt you. I know, sometimes that is the way it is, but still we try, still we do what we must do. You said you answered. That's why you're hurt. You gave answers to someone. Who? I sat up. grimacing as my arm twanged. And why wasn't it me? Before he could tell me, I looked down at my hands. Incredibly, I was still holding Mr. One-Eye. Even more incredibly, he was still alive. His poor sunken eye fixed me with a dulled orange gaze. And something shot me in the heart. The force of a freight train, burning just like a bullet, boring through me. Instead of smoke, it left a question in its wake. Hurt, stop it, hurting, stop, please. Without thinking, only feeling, I cradled Mr. One-Eye to my chest and held him. Pain erupted in my shoulder, overwhelming and familiar. The rotting void, endless and eternal, boring a tunnel to my very core, manifesting as a caving wound. But this time it didn't spread. It didn't grow. It didn't swallow me and the world surrounding. It did not become the only thing I had known, or the only thing I knew, or the only thing I would ever know. It stayed where it was, confined to its tunnel. It had no choice, because there was something more important in my hands, something bright and living, something alive and whole. Mr. One-Eye shifted his wings, then stretched upward. I raised him so he could look at me. His beautiful, sparkling orange eye met mine. Then he stretched out, beak catching the fabric of my coat, and stepped onto my shoulder. For the first time since my son was born, I felt whole. He who listens wasn't quite so thrilled. "What have you done?" he wailed. Tears welled in his great yellow eyes as he stared at the ghastly wound in my arm. I stared too. I couldn't help it. It looked as rotten as it felt, a huge ruptured wound tunneling through my arm. It will never go away. It will never fade. It will only grow. You will have that wound and feel that pain growing until it finally consumes you. Before I could say a word, Mr. One-Eye flapped his wings. The feathers whacked my face, shockingly strong. Immediately the pigeons around us responded. They came in a bobbing grey wave, pooling around my feet where they began to preen. As I watched, they dropped their preened feathers, glistening, shimmering grey overlaid with every colour of the rainbow, at my feet. When the last pigeon had dropped the last feather, Mr. One-Eye tucked his head under his wing and pulled out a feather of his own. Then he crept his way down my arm, one foot in front of the other, left, right, and placed his feather inside my wound. The feather lay atop it for a moment, shining. Then it melted into that rotting crater, leaving a delicate thread of whole, unblemished flesh stretched across the hole. I reached down and grabbed the pile of feathers at my feet, stuffing it into the hole. It was like magic. It was magic. Each feather shone and melted into fresh flesh. 2 handfuls later, there was no wound. After 3, there wasn't even a scar. By the end, even the pain was gone. I laughed. It felt alien to laugh, rusty, even wrong, but it came out anyway, erupting out of me like a geyser. As I laughed, he who listens wept. "No," he moaned. "No, no, no. What are you doing? This is wrong." Tears fell from his great yellow eyes, shining like diamonds under the streetlights. Suddenly I felt guilty. "I'm sorry," I lied. "I didn't know. I won't do it again." His face broke apart. "You are lying and you don't even know it. If I show you what we do, you will ruin everything." That actually offended me. "Then don't show me anything. It's not like I asked." "I have no choice," he sniffled. "I must do what I must do. You will do what you will do. Come." He toddled down the street. I hesitated for reasons I still don't understand. Then I followed. So did the pigeons. He who listened spun around. "No, they cannot! They cannot!" On my shoulder, Mr. One-Eye beat his wings again, whipping my face. The other pigeons obediently dispersed. He who listens continued to argue with me about Mr. One-Eye, but I held my ground. "People say you're forever responsible for what you tame. I didn't tame Mr. One-Eye, but I saved him. I think that makes me even more responsible, and I said so." "Oh no," he wept. "No, this is wrong. You will be wrong. What am I to do?" "You are to show me what you're supposed to show, or leave." "I cannot leave. I have no choice." "Then let's get going." He wiped tears from his face and flicked them onto the concrete where they spattered like silvery rain. And as we moved down the street, I saw people who hadn't been there just a few minutes ago, but they all looked like they'd been there for hours, languishing in the alleys, spread eagle on the sidewalks, leaning against buildings as sobs shook their bony shoulders. As we drew closer, one turned to look at us. Wide yellow eyes glimmered in its round face. A rotting wound glistened under its nose. The flesh of its lips had been eaten to the bone, exposing the teeth. "Are these? Do they listen?" Are they all like you? No, he sobbed. They're like you. They did not listen. They answered. They gave too much. They gave what they couldn't get back. We walked in silence after that. I avoided his yellow eyes glistening like coins in the night. He who listened spent all night showing me what to do. Not once, not twice or 3 times, but 12. The first time was a homeless man huddled under a bench in the park. He was sobbing in his sleep, and his face, weathered but unmistakably young, made my heart ache. Sit, said he who listens. What if he wakes up? He will not. Sit and touch him. When I laid my hand on that boy, I felt his yammering heartbeat and saw his pain. I heard it. Worse, I felt it. I felt every terrible step in the tragic procession that led him here, steps that were his fault and steps that weren't. It didn't even matter what was his fault or what wasn't. All that mattered was his pain. Even though I could not take that pain from him, his heart slowed the longer I sat there. By the end, its rhythm was calm and steady. Maybe it was my imagination, but I thought his poor weathered face looked a little less sad too. Yes, he who listens said happily, that is what we do. We listen and we provide comfort by listening. Next, we went to a lady sitting in a roach-infested studio apartment, hollow-eyed and expressionless as she stared at her blank television screen. Kneel, said he who listens. Won't she see me? Not tonight. Kneel and hold her hand. I did as I was told. Once again, I heard and saw and felt the most terrible things, rotting things, things that get inside you and bore tunnels until they kill you. I don't know how long I sat with her, but I know that by the end, her eyes had closed and she was finally sleeping. We saw a child next, alone and wide awake in a foster home, crying for her father, then a young mother weeping in her kitchen, an old man in a nursing home, a teenage boy stomping his way down an empty street while tears coursed down his face, a young woman sobbing by herself in a dark office long after everyone around her had gone home. It might have been a single night. It might have been a week, or a month, or forever, or 10 minutes. Finally, we went to a hospital where a man, balding and exhausted, sat at the bedside of a little girl with sunken eyes and dull, dying skin. I knew she was fading. I knew she would be dead by morning, because when I touched her, I felt only the faintest veil of emotion, all of it warm and soft. So I turned to the father. I didn't sit this time. I leaned over him the way I used to lean over my son whenever he cried, and wrapped my arms around him. His pain hit me with the force of a tsunami, repulsive and powerful. Help, 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 help. I can't lose her. She deserves more. She's all I have. Help her, help her, help. The sheer force punched through my heart, wide as a freight train, hot as a bullet, painful as death by acid bath. The man cried out. I thought I'd hurt him. I recoiled as he lurched forward, reaching for the child on the bed. Her eyes were open, and colour was returning to her face. What have you done? Screamed he who listens. I staggered back, gasping as the wound in my chest pulsed and blood dripped down my chest, soaking my dirty shirt. You've given what you cannot give back. It will consume you. I barely listened. Single-minded purpose filled me, and I knew, in the depths of my missing, punched-out heart, that I had to get outside, right now. Somehow I did. The pigeons were waiting for me, an entire flock on the sidewalk, eyes glittering knowingly. Mr. One-Eye flapped his wings in command. They obeyed, dropping their plucked feathers at my feet. I packed them into my wound. New flesh grew, bright and shimmering as the feathers themselves. It took longer this time, but that wound healed too. No, wept he who listens. No, you cannot do this. You cannot. You are an abomination. I had a vivid mental image of who he listens kneeling at my side, stroking my hair, my hands, holding my face as I wept and raged with no knowledge of his presence. Again I wondered, what was the point of it? No, I told him, the abomination is being able to help people, being able to do something but choosing to do nothing. You are not one who listens. You are only a monster. No, I said, I'm one who listens and does something about it. He left me and didn't come back. That was all right. I didn't need him. I only needed the pigeons. I listened everywhere, to everything and everyone and all their heartbroken, rage-filled, desperate questions. I didn't answer all of them. I learned that some people don't need answers. Many don't even deserve. There are more of those than I ever thought possible. But some did. I always answered those. I had no idea what I was. I knew that I was more than I had been, more than myself, And I knew that I was powerful. I even started to wonder if I was a god. Under the circumstances, I think that was a reasonable thing to wonder. But whether I was a god or not, I could still only be in one place at one time. That's why I needed the pigeons. Pigeons can only be in one place too, but there are so many of them that they're already everywhere. I asked them to listen. They answered me. Because they answered me, I was able to answer so many others. I answered a boy being beaten by cops as a flock of pigeons watched silently from the roofs above. His dog lay beside him, bleeding from bullet holes and panting raggedly. The boy was holding his dog, even though the cops kept hitting his hands. He begged for help. He asked for his mother. He told his dog she was a good girl as she whined, blood spreading across the dirty concrete. Still, they beat him. So I struck them down. One cracked open on the sidewalk. I took his gun and shot the other while he stirred feebly. The boy looked at me, exhausted and horrified in equal measure, began to pray. I knew he was praying to God, probably to stop me from closer, but I pretended he was praying to me anyway. I kneeled down and placed my hands on his poor, whining dog. "Don't hurt her," he wept as agony tunneled through my belly, rotten and corrosive and vile. "Please, she's a good girl." "I know," I told him, then touched his forehead the way I touched my son's when he'd been running a fever. Another bolt of pain shot through my hand. I saw the wound form this time, watched it cave through my palm and spread. The dog got to her feet and nuzzled her owner, tail wagging even as she whined. The boy looked at me, wide-eyed and ashen. "What are you?" I didn't know how to answer. To be honest, I didn't want to. I hobbled my way out of the alley, down a side street and into a narrow little park. The pigeons followed. Mr. One-Eye gave his wing-flapping, face-slapping order. The feathers came, and with it healing. The birds kept listening, and I kept answering. They found a woman, dead-eyed and frozen in fear, huddling as a man with dead eyes bore down on her. I tore his head off. She ran before I could put my hands on her to take away her fear. They found a flea-bitten baby boy in a sodden, sagging diaper, screaming for help in a filthy crib, while his parents nodded off in an equally filthy corner. I answered the baby, but I punished them. They found a girl in a group home as she slid a blade up and down her arms and asked for someone who should have done everything to protect her but destroyed her instead to die. I answered. They found an old woman with a black eye pushing an empty cart along broken sidewalks, asking for her belongings to come back. I answered, but not before punishing the thieves. They found a man sobbing alone in his car, silently pleading for money to feed his kids for the next 3 days. Just the next 3 days, please God. I answered. My answer was taken from someone else, but it was given. They found a mother sobbing for help over her son's blue body, a needle still quivering in his arm. I answered her too. Afterward, I found the man who sold her son the drugs, and then I found the people who sold that man the drugs, and then I found the people who gave them the drugs, and those people were no more. I answered pleas against crime bosses and schoolyard bullies, masked monsters and petty criminals, people who inflicted damage by action and people who inflicted damage by inaction. Dozens, then hundreds, then more, and more, and more. Every answer took from me. I think every answer continued to take. Maybe it's because I've given so many answers and now they all help each other grow. My answers took and took what I can never get back. Even the birds couldn't give back what I gave. But they gave me enough. Right up until the day your people found me. That was my fault. God works best in mysterious ways, especially when those ways are small. I am still mysterious, but I forgot to stay small. I will never make that mistake again. My birds still bring me questions, you know. They're outside right now, on your walls, your roof, your ground, whispering to each other, whispering to Mr. One-Eye, whispering to me. I hear them even down here. They aren't perfect. Nobody is. Some questions don't have answers, and some answers can't be found. My son was one of those. We tried to find him. My pigeons worked as hard as I ever did. Harder, maybe. We couldn't find him. But my boy, he would understand. My boy, he saw the good in everyone and everything. Wherever he is, he sees the good in us not finding him. Because while looking for him, searching for an answer, any answer at all, we were able to give other people the answers they needed. You know about those answers. That's why I'm here. I love these birds as much as my son ever did. Maybe more. I think more. I feel him in them sometimes, or at least I imagine that I do. Holding pigeons, teaching pigeons, loving pigeons isn't like having my son back. Nothing will ever be like having him back. But it is the closest thing I have. It is all I have. Sometimes what we have is all we get. And sometimes I am the only thing someone gets. Well, me and the birds. My son knew what he was talking about. These birds are wonderful. They really do think everyone is their friend. They love being held. They love being taught. They love being loved. They love to help. And they love to listen. Together, my birds and I are always listening to those who ask for answers. We hear them. Right now, they're whispering, right this very minute. We hear them, even down here. I hear their pain, and I hear their rage. That's why you cannot keep me forever, no matter how hard you try. Because hearing their suffering gives me power, and I still hear every minute of the suffering. I hear the children who beg for help. I hear the fathers who cry for justice. I hear the mothers who demand vengeance. I hear because I am one who listens, and I help because I am the one who answers. Growing up, I was always fascinated by ancient books, works that had slipped through the cracks of history, their words untouched for centuries. To me, they were artifacts of forgotten lives, whispers from worlds long past. Unfortunately, I lived in a quiet, uneventful town where there wasn't much to fuel my curiosity, but tucked away in a narrow side street, in the forgotten part of town, there was a tiny antique shop, Clarkson's Curiosities. The shop was dusty, dimly lit, and packed to the brim with relics that seemed to hold pieces of untold stories. It was my sanctuary. The owner, Mr. Clarkson, was a grizzled man in his 60s, always dressed in a worn cardigan with patches at the elbows. His face was lined with wrinkles, but his eyes gleamed with the sharpness of someone who had seen more than he let on. "History isn't just dates and kings," he once said, sliding me a juice box as I sat cross-legged on the shop floor. "It's the life in the cracks, the stories no one bothered to remember." Mr. Clarkson loved to share the histories of his items. I'd spend hours there after school, riding my bike straight from class to the shop. I had seen nearly everything the store had to offer, until one day I overheard him talking to another customer about the back room. "Don't go in there," he told me firmly the first time I asked. "That stuff isn't for young eyes. Some things are better left alone." Of course, those words only deepened my curiosity. One rainy afternoon, while Mr. Clarkson was distracted with a chatty customer, I saw my chance. My heart pounded as I slipped past the dusty curtain separating the main shop from the forbidden back room. It was cramped and dark, the air thick with the smell of aged wood and mildew. Stacks of boxes leaned precariously against the walls, and cobwebs draped over strange, forgotten artifacts. At first I didn't see anything extraordinary, just more relics, gathering dust. But then my eyes landed on a large book, half hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten cloth. It was massive, with a cracked leather cover that looked like it had survived centuries. My 12-year-old hands trembled as I brushed away the dust. The spine was weak, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The writing inside was strange, letters looping and twisting in ways I couldn't comprehend at the time. "What do you think you're doing?" Mr. Clarkson's voice boomed from the doorway, startling me so badly I dropped the book. He marched over, his face red with fury. "I told you not to come in here." I just wanted to see." "You don't have permission to touch that." His hands shook as he picked up the book and cradled it like a wounded animal. "Get out of here, and don't ever go poking around where you don't belong." I didn't argue. I bolted, the sound of his angry muttering trailing behind me. That day never left me. Over the years, my fascination with ancient texts only deepened. I went on to study archaeology and specialized in medieval manuscripts. By the time I was nearing my master's degree, I could read Middle English fluently, but one thing lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch: the mysterious book from Clarkson's shop. For my thesis, I needed an original medieval text to translate and analyze. The memory of that book resurfaced, stronger than ever. I returned to my hometown after nearly a decade away. Clarkson's Curiosities was still there, though the paint on the sign had faded, and the windows were cloudier than I remembered. Mr. Clarkson himself looked older, his movements slower, his face more sunken. "Back again, eh?" he said as I stepped into the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. "Didn't think I'd see you around these parts anymore." "I'm finishing my degree," I explained. "Thought I'd drop by for old time's sake." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Not much has changed here." I made small talk, asking about some of the items on display while subtly steering him toward the front of the shop. "Still got that old globe?" I asked, pointing to a corner. As he shuffled off to retrieve it, I slipped through the curtain into the back room. The layout hadn't changed. My heart raced as I scanned the clutter, and there it was, the book, still buried in the same spot. It felt heavier than I remembered, its leather cover cracked and cold to the touch. Without hesitation, I slid it into my bag and hurried back out. "Thanks for the chat, Mr. Clarkson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll stop by again soon." He muttered, watching me with narrowed eyes. That night, in the dim light of my dorm room, I finally opened the book. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. I realized the text wasn't ancient gibberish. It was Middle English. Here is what the text said. Anno Domini 1347. I write now as the leaves fall from the trees, their gold and crimson hues painting the air with the promise of a cold winter. The world feels peaceful, as it always does in autumn, when the harvest is gathered and the granaries are full. Our kingdom thrives under the reign of King Edward III, though I have never set eyes upon him. His name is whispered with admiration in every corner of the land. They say his court is a place of splendor, where knights clad in gleaming armor bow before him, and poets recite their verses in halls gilded with gold. Even here, in our little village of Ainsworth, we feel the warmth of his rule. Taxes are fair, the roads are safe, and the markets are lively with traders from distant lands. Ainsworth is no grand place, just a cluster of cottages nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. But it is home. The fields are rich with barley, and the river runs clear and cold. The villagers are as close as kin, each one ready to lend a hand or share a meal when times are hard. My family's cottage is small but sturdy, with a thatched roof and a garden that my mother tends with care. She says the herbs she grows, thyme, lavender and rosemary, keep sickness away. My father is a carpenter, his hands roughened by years of shaping wood into tools and wagons. He speaks little, but his presence is steady, like the oak beams that hold up our house. And then there is my sister, Cecily, who never stops talking. At 12 years old, she is a whirlwind of mischief, forever running barefoot through the village and climbing trees with the other children. My days are filled with work and laughter. I rise with the sun to tend the sheep and gather firewood, but by the time the sun is high, I am free to join my friends. There is Henry, the baker's son, whose pockets are always filled with stolen pastries. Then there is Thomas, who dreams of becoming a knight, though his sword is little more than a stick he found in the woods. We spend our afternoons exploring the hills, racing each other through the meadows or skipping stones across the river. On Sundays, we gather in the village square to listen to the minstrels who pass through, their songs filling the air with tales of valor and romance. But the brightest part of my life is Eleanor. She is the miller's daughter, with hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes as green as the fields in spring. We have known each other since we were children, and it has always been understood that we would marry one day. Eleanor has a laugh that bubbles up like the river after a storm, and when she looks at me, it feels as though the rest of the world fades away. We spend hours walking together, talking of the future we will build, a cottage of our own, with a garden for her and a workshop for me. "You'll be the finest carpenter in the village," she said to me just yesterday, her cheeks flushed from the chill in the air. "And I'll bake bread that will make the king himself jealous." "Only if the king has teeth like a goat," I teased, earning myself a playful slap on the arm. The future seems as bright as the harvest moon. The village is bustling with preparations for the winter festival, a time of feasting and dancing. The air smells of roasting chestnuts and spiced cider, and the church bells ring out with a joyful clang. The monks from the abbey have brought word of the king's latest victory in France. The villagers cheer as they hear of our army's triumph, and even the priest smiles as he blesses the crowd. I often think that these are the best days of my life. There is no fear here, no shadow over our hearts. We work hard, we laugh harder, and we dream of tomorrow. I am 16 now, on the cusp of manhood. My father says I will take over his workshop soon, and Eleanor's father has already begun crafting the furniture for our future home. It feels as though everything is falling into place, as though nothing could ever change the peace and happiness we know. November. The air grows colder with each passing day, but life in Ainsworth continues as it always has. The harvest is in, the fires are lit, and the hearths glow with the warmth of winter preparations. The only shadow on our peaceful village is the whispers of sickness from towns far away. Henry first mentioned it after returning from the market in the next village. They say there's an illness spreading, he told me as we sat by the river. Comes with the rats. People fall sick, grow boils, and die within days. Rats. Our fields and barns have always had them, scurrying in the shadows and gnawing at the grain. What could be different now? Stories, Thomas said, scoffing as he sharpened his stick sword against a rock. Frightened fools love to make up tales to pass the time. I agreed. What sickness could possibly reach our quiet valley? We were safe here, hidden from the world. And so, I pushed the thought from my mind, focusing instead on my family and Eleanor. December 4th. It began with old Widow Hargrove. She had always been frail, her face a maze of wrinkles, her back bent like a crooked tree. When she fell ill, no one thought much of it. Winter claims the old, as my father says. But then the boils appeared, black and angry, swelling beneath her skin until they burst, oozing foul-smelling pus. Her coughing grew wet and thick, and within 3 days she was gone. The village buried her quietly, and life went on. Then it was the miller's boy and his young bride. They had been married not 3 months, their laughter still echoing through the square. Eleanor and I had danced at their wedding. Now they lay side by side in their cottage, their bodies twisted in agony, their faces unrecognizable beneath the blackened swellings. The priest said a blessing over them, his voice trembling. Deus nos punire peccatis nostris. God is punishing us for our sins, he proclaimed, urging the villagers to gather in the church to repent. December 7th. I began to notice the rats everywhere. They seemed bolder, scurrying through the streets in broad daylight, their red eyes gleaming like embers. Eleanor said she had seen them in the mill, gnawing at the sacks of grain. Don't touch them, my father warned. They bring filth. But by then it was too late. The Thompsons, our next-door neighbours, were the next to fall. Their youngest daughter cried in the street, her tiny hands gripping the hem of my tunic as she begged for help. They're burning, she sobbed, her voice hoarse. I dared to step inside their home and immediately regretted it. The smell was unbearable, a rancid mix of sweat, blood, and decay. Mr. Thompson lay on the floor, his body convulsing, while his wife sat slumped in a chair, her face hidden beneath her hands. I could see the black sores on her arms, her flesh cracked and leaking. December 15th. I write this with shaking hands. My mother and Cecily have fallen ill. It began with a fever, their faces flushed and their bodies hot to the touch. Then came the boils, horrid black lumps that sprouted like weeds across their skin. My sister weeps constantly, her voice barely a whisper now, while my mother grows delirious, calling out to my father and to God. The coughing is the worst. It is deep and wet, rattling through their frail bodies as though it will tear them apart. Blood spills from their lips in dark, sticky rivulets. I sit by their bedsides, holding their hands, praying for their recovery. But in my heart, I know the truth. The plague has come to Ainsworth, and it will not leave until it has taken us all. December 20th. The church bells ring day and night, calling the villagers to repentance. Father Edmund stands at the altar, his robe stained with the blood of the dying as he pleads with us to seek God's forgiveness. Veni ad Deum, quia nos puniunt peccata nostra, come to God, for he punishes us for our sins, he cries, his voice breaking with despair. The church is packed, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and fear. People wail and scream, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Some tear at their clothes, others flagellate themselves with whips, their backs striped with blood. They believe their suffering will appease God, will make him spare them. But the plague does not care for prayers. The streets are quiet now, save for the cries of the dying and the soft scurrying of rats. Doors remain shut, windows boarded up. No one dares to leave their homes, unless it is to carry another body to the mass grave at the edge of the village. Eleanor's father fell ill yesterday. She stays at his bedside, refusing to leave despite the risk. I long to see her, to hold her, but I cannot. My father forbids it, and deep down I know he is right. How did this happen? How did our thriving kingdom, our peaceful village, come to this? I fear it is only a matter of time before the plague takes us all. December 24th. There are strange men wandering through the village now, dressed in long robes, their faces hidden behind bird-like masks. The masks are made of dark leather, with long, curved beaks that seem to hold bundles of herbs or perfumes. They walk the streets in silence, their heavy cloaks dragging in the muck of the dirt roads, and every time they pass, the air grows thick with the scent of my mother's herbs, cloves, cinnamon and rosemary. Yet something darker lingers beneath. It smells of rot, as if the earth itself is decaying beneath our feet. They claim to be doctors, but I do not trust them. No, I don't think they are doctors at all. December 28th. Yesterday I saw one of them near the town square. His mask was thick with dust, his eyes hidden beneath dark round lenses. He held a long wooden stick in his hand, and when someone, an old man, bent over with fever, approached him, the doctor struck him across the back with it. The old man cried out, but the doctor didn't stop. He simply walked on, as if nothing had happened, leaving the man stumbling behind, beaten and humiliated. People still flock to them, though. Why? I cannot understand it. Perhaps they believe these bird-faced men hold some cure for the plague, some remedy hidden beneath their masks. They bring no potions, no healing herbs, no treatments. Instead, they only spread fear. They walk through our streets like gods, untouchable, wearing masks of death. But not once have I seen them treat anyone. All they do is slap their sticks on the ground, demanding the sick stay back, yelling words in Latin that no one understands. "Stay back, filthy wretches," they bark, pushing the sick and desperate away. I watched one of them last week as he went into the home of a woman I once knew. She had fallen ill with the plague, her skin blackened and swollen. I saw him enter her door, but when he came out, he didn't look at her once. He didn't even bend down to check if she still lived. He turned his head as if he had seen nothing, gave her house a quick glance, and walked away without a word. Her body lay in that room for days before the village saw fit to bury her. January 5th. The villagers are desperate, as we all are. They have no other choice but to believe that these men in masks have the answers. They say the doctors bring with them the air of life, whatever that means. But I think it's nothing more than a lie. I believe these masked figures are causing the very sickness they claim to heal. I wonder if they are the true cause of this plague, spreading it with every step they take, their poisons and perfumes carried by the winds they stir. I heard a rumour today from Thomas. He overheard the village priest speaking to Father Edmund in hushed tones. They believe the doctors are part of a larger conspiracy, a group hired by the king himself to cleanse the kingdom. They are here to control the people, to make them suffer in their own desperation. I cannot fathom why the king would allow such people into our homes, our streets. The people grow sicker each day, but still, we are told to trust the doctors. But I cannot trust them. How can I? January 8th. It was this morning that I saw one of the masked doctors in front of our house. My father stood at the door, his arms crossed, watching the doctor as he came up the lane. He was tall, his mask black and sharp, looking like something from a nightmare. The doctor's eyes, behind the dark lenses, were unreadable, hollow. The doctor stopped in front of our house and began to raise his stick, but my father stepped forward. "You will not come near us," my father said, his voice firm but shaking. The doctor did not reply. Instead, he swung his stick at my father's leg, knocking him to the ground. I rushed to him, but the doctor raised his stick again, a threat in his eyes. Without a word, he turned and walked away, as though we were nothing more than pests beneath his feet. I stayed with my father, helping him to his feet, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He too knows something is terribly wrong. January 12th. Now, as I write this, I cannot shake the feeling that these doctors have brought more than just sickness to our door. They bring fear, they bring distrust, and I believe that they themselves are not just a symbol of this plague, they are its spreaders. If they are the cause of this, I do not know how we can stop it. No one can say no to them. They have power, they are untouchable. And if the king has sent them, perhaps he knows more than we do about their purpose. I do not know how much longer I can stand by and watch as my village crumbles. The plague spreads like wildfire, and these doctors walk among us, untouched, spreading more than just death. They are spreading despair. God help us. January 13th. I awoke this morning to the sound of silence, an emptiness that clung to the air like the fog creeping in through the cracks of the window. I rose from my bed, feeling the weight of dread pressing down on me. The coldness of the room mirrored the emptiness in my heart. My family, once so full of life, lay quiet and still. I needed water. I had to get out for a moment. Maybe the fresh air would clear my mind. Let me forget the sickness that had taken over this house, this town, this world. I was gone only a short while, but when I returned, everything had changed. The door to my house was slightly ajar, and as I stepped inside, a nauseating smell hit me, the stench of decay, of death. I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I walked into the kitchen and froze in place. A doctor, one of those cursed men in the bird masks, stood in the center of the room. He was leaning over a table, and I could see with horror what he was doing. Rats. Dozens of them. They scurried across the floor, driven by the doctor's hand. They were being let loose into my home. Why? I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor turned slowly, as if surprised to see me. Without a word, he reached for his stick and swung it at my chest. The force knocked me backward. Deus te oblitus est, he muttered, though the words felt like ice on my skin. The words were cold, without care, without humanity. I tried to stand, but the pain in my ribs was too much. Blood pooled in my mouth. I barely had time to raise my hands in defense before he struck me again. When he left, I was left bleeding on the floor. But the rats, they had already begun their work. The doctor, or whatever he truly was, had sealed our fates. I crawled inside, but by the time I made it back to my family, it was too late. My mother and father, my sister, they were all lying in their beds, their skin mottled with boils and discolored patches. Blood spurted from their mouths in torrents, and their bodies convulsed in their final moments. I heard the gurgling, the choking sounds. My sister's body was racked with coughs, her face twisted in pain, the blood splattering her pale skin. I could not do anything. I should have saved them, but how? I couldn't even touch them without recoiling. Their eyes, vacant and wide, stared at me as I screamed for help that would never come. And then I heard it, the sound I had longed to hear amidst the chaos. Her voice, my love. She appeared in the doorway, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. She was coughing, her breath ragged, but there was still a fire in her eyes. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to save her, but the sickness had already begun to work its way into her veins, into her lungs. Without thinking, we fled. We ran as far as we could, but it didn't matter. The village was falling. The plague had already claimed my family, my friends. We found a small house at the edge of the town. Its walls were weak, the roof sagging, but we hid there together. It was all I could do. But I knew, deep down, it was already too late. Her coughs grew worse. Blood stained the cloth she held to her lips. I held her hand, feeling her pulse slow with each breath she took. I felt it too, the sharpness in my chest, the burning fever. January 20th. I can't stand it any longer. This world is over. There is nothing left but darkness. I write this with my last breath, cursing anyone who dares to read these words. May the plague follow you. May it haunt you. May it consume your family, your lover, your village, just as it has consumed mine. I am nothing now. I will be forgotten. But you will carry this curse. And if there is any justice in this forsaken world, you will meet the same fate I have. I will die today, and I will take the last of my hope with me. May God have mercy on my soul. January 22nd. I close my eyes now, and all I hear is the rasp of her breath. And then, nothing. The diary's final pages were smudged with blood. The ink had bled together, leaving only a garbled mess of letters. But it didn't matter. The teenager had already sealed his fate, and now my fate too seems uncertain. The fog obscures your view of the destination, much like the lack of purpose blinds your direction in the first place. There was once a time when everything felt grounded, rooted in reality, trying desperately not to be torn away. My grandfather wasn't a man you'd describe as unusual. He often spoke of the same issues most Americans face: money troubles, politics, family, but nothing ever out of the ordinary. That's why it's so hard for me to write this now. The weight he carried, the chains that bind him even in death, revealed a side of him I could barely understand. There was a darkness in him, a shadow of something deeper. He'd lived at the boundary of life and death, a purgatory neither here nor there. And now, because of him, I find myself standing at that same threshold. The trials ahead of me are heavy, suffocating. Help me, not with your actions, but with your thoughts, your condolences. That's the least I can remember now. This all began on my grandfather's deathbed. For weeks, Atlas Jones had been slipping in and out of consciousness, barely able to whisper a request for food or water. It was as though he'd surrendered, letting life slip away. I sat by his side during those long, agonizing weeks, reminding him how much he meant to me, how he had stepped in as a father figure when my own father abandoned me. I idolized my grandfather in every way, but I knew this was the end of his time, and with it, the end of a part of me. Then, out of nowhere, his voice cut through the silence, clear and steady, like he hadn't been bedridden for weeks. "Ronan," he said, "I've got some debts to pay. Take this." He pressed a worn leather journal into my hands. "Find the key to victory that I couldn't. Go, my boy. What's waiting for me isn't going to be pleasant, but I'm grateful for the time we've had together. This journal, it'll answer questions I can't explain now." I barely had time to process his words before the shrill sound of the life support machine filled the room. Nurses rushed in, working desperately to save him, but I already knew. He was gone. Those were his last words, the last truth he could share. Grief washed over me like a tidal wave. I felt hollow, lost. The world seemed to lose all its color, leaving me an empty shell of the person I'd been before. In my despair, I clung to the only thing he left me, the journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages weathered like they'd survived a century of hardship. I opened it carefully, flipping through the brittle pages. Strange abstract drawings filled the margins, symbols and figures I couldn't make sense of. I stopped myself before I delved too deeply and turned back to the first page. Entry number 1, November 8th, 1937. My name is Atlas Jones, and I reckon it's time I jot down some peculiar happenings here on my family's homestead. Hard as it is to believe, I can't deny what I've seen and felt. Today, as I wandered through the woods with my dog, Nova, something unusual caught my eye, a path I'd never noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed it. It led me to a riverbank, untouched and hidden from the world. The scene was alive with turtles, fish, and other critters, like a secret paradise. The water was so clear I couldn't resist diving in. That's when I heard it. A voice. "Hello," a young girl said. Startled, I raised my head above the surface and saw her. She looked about my age. Nervous, I stammered, "I'm sorry, am I on your property? I just found this place today, I swear." She smiled warmly. "No, you're fine. My property's just across the river. Want to come see it?" "Sure," I said, wading out of the water. "I'm Atlas, by the way. What's your name?" "Lyra," she replied, extending her hand. "I'm 19. You look to be about the same age, am I right?" "Close. I'm 17. People say I look older, though," I replied. "Strange I haven't seen you at the high school. We live in the same district, don't we? The next school's 30 miles off." Lyra shook her head. "I was homeschooled. My mother never saw a reason for me to go. But what about you, Atlas? Why are you out here wandering the woods instead of at a baseball game or with your friends?" "Well," I began, "I guess I'm just curious. The forest feels unknown, unlike the rest of the world, where you can predict the headlines in the newspaper or the score of a ball game. Out here, there's always something new to discover." Lyra nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to see it. But let me ask you this. What if those predictable things could change, but only if you showed up? I've spent so much time out here, I sometimes feel like I've given my mind to these trees." She chuckled softly. "Maybe I'm overthinking it, but at least we've got some common ground, right?" As we walked, a large, weathered homestead appeared. The two-story house seemed like it had stood through centuries, its earthy tones blending into the forest. "Lyra, how old is this place?" I asked, staring at the structure. "My mother says it was built in the early 1700s by German colonists. It's been remodeled over the years," she replied, scanning her home as though seeing it anew. "Would it be all right if I met your mother? I don't want to be rude, being on her property without her knowing." "She's not here today," Lyra said, skipping toward the door. "Maybe another time. Want to come inside?" The scent of old wood filled my nostrils as I stepped inside. The house seemed both ancient and well kept, its walls lined with strange, antique trinkets. I followed Lyra as she led me down into the basement, which was filled with shelves of exotic teas. She handed me a basket of tea packages. "Here, take these. They're my favorites," she said, before excusing herself to use the restroom. Alone, my eyes wandered. A peculiar jar caught my attention. A maroon liquid inside glowed faintly, almost alive. My curiosity was interrupted by a strange sensation, as though someone were watching me. I turned slowly to see Lyra peeking out from behind a wooden pillar, her grin unnervingly wide. She whispered, "You like that? You like that? You like that?" Startled, I tried to play it off with humor. "Maybe I do. Maybe you've got a potion in there for me," I joked, forcing a laugh. Lyra tilted her head, her smile softening. "Don't rule it out. But for now, I'd rather hear more about you, Atlas." Entry number 1, November 8th, 1937. "Well, Lyra, I'd love to walk you back, but I better head home before my mother's pot roast gets cold," I said with a grin. "Of course, let's get you back to your side of the river, trespasser," Lyra teased, her voice dripping with playful sarcasm. To be honest, there's not much to tell about myself, apart from my curiosity for the unknown. I've got 4 books on the first expeditions into the Amazon rainforest. The idea of a boundless world just fascinates me, I remarked. "Ah, the Amazon. I've faced many terrors there myself. A strange platform for anomalies, that place," Lyra replied, a flicker of uncertainty in her tone. "What do you mean? We're in Utah, Lyra. How could you know anything about the Amazon rainforest?" I asked, laughing at her strange comment. "Oh, you're right. I must be getting tired," she said, brushing it off. Then, with a twinkle in her eye, she added, "Will I see you tomorrow, Atlas?" "Of course, Lyra. You be safe walking home now," I said, meeting her gaze warmly. As I ate my mother's pot roast that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something magical about meeting Lyra. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. But I'll leave the speculation for my next journal entry. Entry number 2, November 9th, 1937. I woke in a cold sweat after a peculiar dream. I was running aimlessly through the forest at night, pursued by unseen beings I could feel but not see. Their presence clung to the air like a shadow I couldn't escape. After breakfast, I decided to return to the spot where I met Lyra. Strangely enough, before I even reached the river, a hand emerged from a bush ahead, offering to help me climb the steep terrain. Startled, I jolted back, but before panic could set in, Lyra appeared, laughing at my reaction. "I'm sorry if I startled you, tough guy," she said, chuckling. "I'll take the hit for that one," I replied sheepishly. "I could have handled that better." "No worries, Atlas. You'll get a chance to redeem yourself. I'm going to show you something I've never shared with anyone before. Just promise me you won't freak out. As long as it doesn't involve making me a human sacrifice," I joked. Lyra led me down a steep ridge to a clearing where wooden sculptures stood like ancient sentinels, untouched by time. "Lyra, your work is incredible, but don't you think placing this stuff in the middle of nowhere might give someone the wrong idea? It could really spook people," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Atlas, I didn't make these," she replied, her voice tinged with awe. "I found them here. They've been waiting, untouched. There's something ancient and ethereal about this place. I feel nostalgic here, as if I've been here before." I approached one of the humanoid sculptures, brushing my hand against its surface. A chill crept up my arms, and a deep, foreign unease settled in my stomach. Before I could speak, a piercing humanoid screech echoed around us. We froze, then bolted for her house. I slipped on a rock, pain shooting through my leg, but Lyra helped me up, her face pale with fear. "It was probably a feral hog," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "They can make some strange noises." "I've lived in these woods my whole life," I replied. "That wasn't a hog. What's really going on here, Lyra? And how did you find me yesterday?" "I told you I just stumbled across you," she said, visibly shaken. "Atlas, I hate to admit this, but I believe these woods are haunted by ancient spirits, dark ones. Maybe another world is bleeding into ours. I have something that might help." Back at her home, she lit a bundle of white sage, the smoke filling the room with a purifying scent. "Great," I muttered. "This might help, but honestly, I think we're overthinking things. Maybe it's all in our heads." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her diary, filled with sketches of fragmented, shadowy entities. My blood ran cold when I turned the page and saw a drawing of myself, surrounded by a dark, ominous cloud. "Lyra, why would you draw something like this?" I asked, trying to mask my fear. "Atlas, something dark is attached to you. It doesn't want to destroy you, it wants you. It's feeding off your life force. I can help, but you have to trust me," she pleaded. "I'm going home," I said, standing. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to be involved in this. It's not personal. I'm just not feeling myself today." Whatever you think of me, Atlas, I'm here to help. I'll keep you in my prayers, Lyra said softly. Walking home, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread, a darkness foreign and all-consuming. I'll avoid the woods for now, but part of me fears I've dug too deep into something I wasn't meant to uncover. Entry number 3, November 16, 1937. It has been over a week now, and I must confess I am utterly exhausted, my nerves are frayed, my strength depleted. I've drawn so deeply from my own reserves of adrenaline that I scarcely feel steady anymore. Since last I laid eyes upon Lyra, my nights have been plagued by nightmares, visions of shadowy woods, moonless and impenetrable, where dark, humanoid figures pursue me endlessly, intent on erasing me from this world and the next. I've tried all manner of remedies, keeping to the town, avoiding the woods and even Lyra herself, occupying my time with friends, but nothing has eased my distress. The thought gnaws at me that perhaps I'm approaching an inevitable truth, one I'd much rather deny. There may be more to this world than I've ever dared to believe. This fog of melancholy and dread left me no choice but to seek out Lyra once more. I needed answers, closure to this waking nightmare. As I ventured into the woods, the whispers began. Malignant voices hissed from unseen corners, reminding me that your end lies beyond this world and beyond understanding. The meaning escaped me, though I took it as a threat, a grim one at that. Even so, I pressed on, fixing my gaze upon the setting sun ahead, a final bastion of beauty amidst the torment of my thoughts. There was still bravery in my heart, though it felt like it might slip through my grasp at any moment. My reflection was abruptly shattered by the brush of something against my hair. I looked up to see the horror. Dozens of mutilated deer strung upside down from the trees, their lifeless forms swaying, their grotesque remains brushing my shoulders. My stomach turned violently. Before I could scream, I vomited everything I had within me. "Atlas, come!" Lyra's voice rang out in the distance, sharp and commanding. I wiped my mouth and set aside my terror, running toward the sound of her call, but no matter where I turned, I could not find her. "Lyra!" I cried. "Call again, louder, so I might find you." Her voice came, low and calm, yet somehow chilling. "Right behind you, Atlas." I turned and found her standing there, her face pale and stricken with an expression I could not place. I opened my mouth to scold her for sneaking up on me in such a manner, but I stopped short. Something weighed heavily upon her, and I knew it was far more important than my own indignation. "Lyra," I demanded, "what in God's name were those deer? Who's behind this madness on our property? I need answers, and I need them now." She held my gaze, unbroken and resolute. "It is time you meet my mother, Atlas. Time for you to learn the truth of why fate has brought you to me." Without another word, she turned and led me deeper into the woods. The path grew narrow and dark, the light slowly fading until it was little more than a memory. My soul seemed to dim with it, a weight pressing heavily on my chest. We reached a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. This was no ordinary place. It was the very realm from my nightmares. Desperately, I pinched myself, certain this must be some cruel dream, but no amount of pain woke me. Lyra stopped and pointed ahead. There, crouched by a fire, sat an ancient woman, her form decrepit and her face twisted by years of suffering. My fear was tempered only by my need for answers. I rushed forward. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why am I enduring these horrors? What do you want from me?" The old woman's voice rasped like wind through dead leaves. "Through centuries new and old, every 15th blue moon, our shaman is drawn to these lost lands, unknowing yet destined. You, Atlas, are the reincarnation of our shaman. Bow to your purpose." At her words, 1,000 dark, humanoid figures emerged from the shadows, bowing low in reverence. Tribal music, haunting and primal, filled the air, echoing across the strange plain. I yelled for help, but the louder I screamed, the louder they chanted in praise. Then, a memory flooded back to me. At the age of 10, my great-aunt visited our homestead, bringing native artifacts and tales of a distant ancestor who had married into a tribe during the colonization of the West. Could this cursed bloodline be my own? Was I truly part of some spiritual conspiracy to revive a long-lost culture? The notion was absurd, and yet, if I were to accept this role, what would my task be? I asked, barely able to form the words. The old woman's face twisted into a cruel smile. "It is no choice of yours. It is your birthright." A vision seized me then, vivid and terrible. I saw myself leading cults in worship of an unknown entity, demanding sacrifices to trap souls in a purgatory of eternal torment. The wrath of this spirit was tied to the stolen lands of the colonizers. Those who fell into its grasp would suffer alongside their ancestors until the tribe's lands were restored. In the midst of the vision, my grandfather's face appeared, crumbling into dust. When the vision ended, a hand rested firmly on my shoulder. I turned to see my grandfather, long dead, his face marked with sorrow. "Grandson," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "you must take the throne. We are cursed to perpetuate this cycle, to sabotage our own, until the end of time. There is no escape." "Why?" "Granddaddy, how in the hell were you acting as a showman without any of us knowing, and why would you agree to such evil?" I demanded with intensity that couldn't be matched by anyone I've ever known. "These humanoid creatures you see bowing down to you as we speak will cover your every track up as they did for me. And let's just say that if you don't, everyone out of your immediate family will be damned to this hellish realm. I chose you and your father's grandson. I know I'm not a human worth of existence, but I did what anyone else would have done for his family. I'm truly sorry, but now the burden is yours, grandson." I couldn't believe what was coming out of his mouth, but it was my decision to make now. Would I allow my father and little brother to perish into a hellish purgatory after their lives are done? "Grandfather, I guess it's my time to take your throne," I said, shaking and crying in agony. "You did what all of us did too. You aren't a demon when faced with such a burden that can't be undone. Just remember why you're doing this. Don't allow yourself to think that you're a demonic monster that loves what he does. You had no choice. Good luck to you in operating in this realm and the next, my grandson." My grandfather then hugged me and showed me all of his compassion to reassure me that I wasn't the first to experience such a burden. Our family reunion was cut short as the old woman yelled in an ancient language as she did. I was handed a wooden spear and my grandfather bent to his knees, commanding me to strike him down. "Don't feel sorry for me, my grandson. I have the pleasure of being put to rest unlike the souls I damned in this realm." Without allowing myself to delve into deep thought, I struck my grandfather down and took the throne. I looked to my right and saw the old women then hand me a feathered crown and bow down to my feet along with all of the dark humanoid creatures I encountered. Lyra smiled at me and muttered the words, "You'll make a fine shaman, future husband." I then awoke in the middle of the forest, back in my world. I ran to see if Lyra's house still existed, and yet I saw nothing. As I headed back over the river, I thanked the universe that it was all just a weird hallucination that I had. I was overwhelmed with a sense of relief, until Lyra lay in front of me behind the visible trees and said, "Where do we begin?" Entry number 4, November 16th, 2024. It's been so long since I last wrote in this godforsaken journal. Today, I face my end. An end wrought by the crimes I've committed against humanity and the darkness I embraced to protect my family from the horrors of the other realm. Countless souls were damned because of me. And now, Ronan, my grandson, the burden falls to you. Will you strike me down, Ronan, as I did to my grandfather and as he did to his? At the end of the day, the choice is yours. I leave this journal so you'll remember. You're not alone in this cursed burden. If you decide, like all of us did, to shield our family from the wrath of that realm, then come find me, strike me down and set me free from my sins. That is the final entry in my grandfather Atlas's journal. I've struggled to make sense of it, torn between dismissing it as the ravings of a broken man and fearing deep down that it might all be true. It's hard to accept, but part of me believes my grandfather had been grappling with untreated mental illness since he was 17. Yet another part of me, a darker, quieter part, worries about the validity of his story. In my grief and respect for his memory, I've decided to visit the coordinates listed in the journal, a remote forest in Utah, where this supposed ceremony is meant to take place. I'll see for myself if any of this is real. I'll keep you updated. Could it really be my turn to take the throne?